Hello everyone, join me, Quinns, on my quest to review the world's best TTRPGs. And there are so many of them. They're as limitless as the human imagination. Just imagine a quest that never ends. But stories should end, shouldn't they? We're reviewing a fantasy TTRPG today, and you know what that means. Swords! Horse! This guy! Now I know what you're thinking. You've played a fantasy RPG before. Swords, horse, that guy? You've seen it all before. You come to Quinn's Quest for something different, and what could be less interesting than dungeons and/or dragons? But listen, nobody knows better than me that there are an unfathomable number of fantasy RPGs out there right now. I have spent the last few years trying to fathom them, and mostly I've come away indecisive and annoyed and often quite hungry. Picture me grumpily closing about 18 different tabs of research in my web browser because all of these games look kinda cool, but also kinda expensive, and also I want my fantasy games to feel fantastic. And there is something about all of these games competing for one another's market share and borrowing one another's ideas like crabs in a bucket that makes them all feel like the furthest thing from fantastical. And then I read Mythic Bastionland, a game that does the three things that I need. It is truly fantastical, it is a fantastic design, and most importantly, it stands utterly apart from the crowd. A game that captures the nostalgic magic of RPGs from the 80s with hexes and cruelty and mystery, but also is so forward-looking it maybe feels like it was sent back in time from the future. A game I didn't simply run a big campaign of to do this review, because that's the Quinn's Quest guarantee. You can always expect me to run a full campaign of the games I review before I start writing my script. But where me and my friends, after we finished our campaign of Mythic, decided we were going to find or make or steal the time required to continue our campaign after this review is finished. That's no longer me being professional, that's just gluttony. And are you ready for the really crazy part? I mean, this book is like made up of nothing but crazy parts. It's like hanging out with Mr. Potato Head if he was also smarter than you. So first off, this seems like a pretty big book, right? Well, that's only because more than 2/3 of it is this mead-soaked mail-order catalogue of 72 freakish knights you might play and 72 epic problems that your players might conquer on a good day, but where no good-thinking individual could blame you for getting absolutely Other crazy things? This is a game that would support players who want to play it for just 2 evenings, but also support you if you wanted to play it for 2 years. Or how about the fact that this book offers epic experiences like war and administrating your realm, but it actually has just 16 pages of rules? Or how about the fact that this game has my favorite combat system that I've ever seen in a fantasy RPG? There is a catch, though. Let's get my campaign notes out. Ooh, my dice! Never leave them in behind. So one of the reasons that Mythic Bastionland achieves so much is that designer Chris McDowall is a beast when it comes to writing sentences and rules that do a lot with a little. But the other reason that this game is so singular is that other TTRPGs are like an opportunity for you and me to use our imagination. Mythic Bastionland is like a 200-page ransom note saying you will use your imagination. This game is like Chris McDowall taking you to a cliff edge and strapping you into the hang glider that he built in his garage, and you say, "Oh gee, Chris, what are we gonna do with this?" And he puts an arm around your neck and says, "You're gonna fly." Are you ready for a review? I'm ready for a review. Let's get into the rippling set of pistons that is how this system works. But first, let's stay hydrated. Opening this book, the first thing you'll find is the merest sneeze of a rule set that at once covers everything you might want to do and also seems to want to leave your company like it thinks you might have a disease. Like, okay, here's how you make a dungeon. It'll always have 6 points, 2 dangers, 1 treasure. Here's how you travel. It depends if you have a horse. Here's what your stats look like. You've got 4 of them. What? No, you don't have any skills. If you want more paperwork, quit bothering me and go apply for a loan. This book teaches you the rules like there's someone stood behind you it needs to teach next. But let's be clear, these rules aren't just super short, they're also super sharp. It's like Chris McDowall is disinterested in all the conversations about whether rules should provide a story or a simulation. Chris instead thinks, is it simple and is it fun? I'll give you one case study in this. So at the end of a session of Mythic Bastionland, everyone around the table has to decide how much time passes before you pick up the story again. And for everyone around the table whose character now becomes old, the rule for that in the book is like so funny and so true and so sad that when I read it, it was like a spear through my chest. Basically, you just re-roll your stats. And if you get higher than what your stats were, your stat stays the same. But if you roll lower, that's your new stat. With your character defined by their high clarity, with keen instinct, lucid mind, and shrewd eyes. Not anymore, you now have a poor instinct, an unlucid mind, and bad eyes. The other players in your party are gonna be like, Sir Dunstan, please, it's time, give us the magic sword. And you're gonna say, you listen to me and you listen good. You can go f yourself. Or, if you look in the section, in the page on warfare, Chris says that if you get about 24 people fighting together, the game calls that a warband, and you basically treat it as a single large enemy that is immune to the player's normal attacks. Is that the best way to simulate mass combat? Who cares? It's simple, it's evocative, and it's a game. The GM can introduce that rule in a single breath. Your players around the table are all going to start panicking until they realize that as Knights of the Realm, this is a game about knights, I should have mentioned that. Everyone plays knights, it's Knights, the game. They realize that they can start assembling warbands of their own. Sir Dunstan, we know you're in there, come out. I've got 20 lumberjacks with me carrying axes. Hand over the sword. Okay. Now, the risk when you're designing a game that's as minimalist as this, where it's like the designer wrote it with every keystroke costing them money, is that sometimes the game can get a little lost along the way. The reader, you and me, can finish the book and think to themselves, cool, I still don't know how to run this game. And for a case study in this, you could look at Ultraviolet Grasslands. Now, I love this book. It's so trippy, and I would recommend people buy it just to read it. Sorry, I've been completely thrown off my game by this awesome piece of art of a woman free soloing a face. But I'm never going to run this game because I don't know how. I think that bit got lost somewhere among all of the sentient sunflowers and womb factories. I'm very happy to say that Mythic Bastionland is the furthest thing from this. The rules are written with this spectacular clarity. The procedure of this game all fits into place as you read it. And if anything doesn't make sense, this book has one of the best examples of play I've ever written. Read. I didn't write this book. It would make sense why I'm being so positive about it though. But that would be biased. The examples of play are indexed by the exact type of scene you might be having trouble with, and with a sort of director's commentary in the sidebar with such marvelously humanizing stuff as, yeah, I think in this scene the GM basically forgot about this mechanic, and you can see how they're struggling to make the scene work without it. Before writing this review, I spoke to designer Chris McDowall about his design process. So let's visit him now in my knowledge tower.
What I've always tried to do is what I call rules light, flavor heavy, which sounds like very sort of cringy marketing copy, but what I kind of mean by that is, certainly when I started designing games, it felt like there were lots of rules light games that were just like one page, but were also like super generic. Like it would either assume that you were just going to use it to run D&D dungeons, or it was just like a generic thing where it's like, oh, you can play anything with this. And then all of the games that were super like flavorful were like monstrosities, like, you know, Rifts. All these games that sort of sounded like they had lots of really juicy, cool flavor, but were just like completely daunting for me to play. And you know, Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay being a really good example of that. So trying to thread the needle of having rules light, but with lots of flavor is something I've always tried to do.
So, with the rules and the examples of play, that's about 40 pages. And then the entire rest of the book is made up of those 72 knights and 72 profoundly evocative myths. Little baby adventures that your players might face. There's only one word for this. It is a stupid amount of creativity and labor. 72 is a high enough number that you really can't grasp how big it is. I keep browsing this book and finding new ones I still haven't read, which feels magical. It feels mythical. And all 144 of these pages are beautifully illustrated by artist Alec Sorenson. And his work is full of all these little references to the lush text of the page, making Mythic Bastionland a great coffee table book in its own right. However, in stark contrast to Mythic Bastionland's crystalline rules, these pages may appear, when you read them, to be threateningly vague. Sure, these knights have names and property and abilities and passions and even a poem, but what they don't have, what you will want to shake the book to see if it falls out, is any explanation of what Chris is... what he's really on about, basically. If you're the key knight, nobody is going to tell you why you're carrying around a bag full of baby teeth. If you're the tiger knight, nobody's going to tell you why your horse has tattoos. If you're the bone knight, you can learn things from the bones of the dead, but only by acquiring bones from the living, but only by trading other bones with them. And so that player can look forward to playing an entire other micro RPG where they're always looking for bones and asking people if they have any bones, which is like great, obviously, but you're also going to be like, wait, what? But the game's moved on. It's talking about the Salt Knight now, or the Violet Knight, with her ability to project light that only bees can see. It sounds like I'm making this shit up. I'm really not. But if the players are scratching their head, for the GM, it's so much worse. For the GM, it's like they've signed up to an entire course in head scratching at an online university. These myths that you're going to be running are like whole adventures, right? But you have to divine what that adventure actually is at your table from these sweet little fragments that lie on the page like a shattered chocolate bar. You get 6 terse scenes that get increasingly marvelously dire if players don't do anything, allowing the plot to ferment. You get maybe 3 stat blocks, 1 batshit random table, and a goddamn oldie English poem that at my home game, whenever that content was introduced, I liked to freeze the game and ask my players for a moment of silence so I could read the poem and we could all feel the words harden at our table and in our imaginations like so much frost. Not all that grows is good and fair. Not all from above an answered prayer. And then my players are like, what the f does that mean? And I'm like, I don't know, dude, good luck. But there's a lesson to be learned in this gorgeous art or these fabulous poems, which is that these details are such lovely finishing touches as to tell you that these pages are finished. So when you look at them and you think, well, this seems a little incomplete, and then when you complete them by the GM presenting them to the table and filling in the gaps themselves, or the players prodding them, and then as a group of people you figuring out what this myth is, that's the game. That is the point where your hang glider has taken off and your feet are no longer touching the ground. And yet at the same time, and this is very important for my personal enjoyment of Mythic Bastionland, this game is the furthest thing from a blank canvas. This is why I like to play different games. It's because when I sit down to play them at my table, they help me to present something that will feel to my players as new and exciting, help us to tell different kinds of stories. And what I'm looking for when I'm deciding on new games to play is that I want my voice, my fingerprints, the light in my eyes to become that of the person that made the game. So yes, part of this game is figuring out who this knight is or what this story is, but what I can guarantee you is that it will always feel like Mythic Bastionland. It will feel eerie and portentous and unmoored from time, and it will taste like a mouthful of earthy psychedelic mushrooms. It's just that at your table, you might take a bit more inspiration from King Arthur, or from the more modern fable of Elden Ring, or perhaps from some more cursed subject matter entirely. Okay, let me do my job. Let me talk a bit more concretely about how you turn these 72 nights and 72 nightmares into a game. And in a lot of ways, this is where Mythic Bastionland starts to get really impressive. Because staring at these pages and seeing what world building emerges in your imagination, that can be a little foggy. But the systems involved in how you actually run this game, it's as intelligent and powerful as human musculature. Let's stay hydrated. So the first thing that you're going to do in your campaign is make your own personal realm made of hexes that your story is going to take place in. And here's a realm from my actual home game that took ideas from me and everyone else around the table. So here's our mountain range that curves outward and backwards like an inclined climbing wall, meaning the sunlight never touches these barren badlands. And then I illustrated it using some very cute, very fun software called HexKit that you can find on itch.io or also in the description of this video. Now, making your very own realm might sound like a lot of work, but like everything in Mythic Bastionland, it's neither a lot nor is it work. And that's because this game tells you exactly what to do and no more. Who lives across the sea? Who lives over that border? I'll tell you who. It's Baron Von Stop Expanding Our Scope. Who are the gods? Ah, don't worry, the book tells us this. Some people are into stars, and some people are into trees. Perfect. What do you mean that's only 2 sentences? Just stick to the plan. Get some terrain types in there, maybe a river, maybe treat your players to a poison swamp. And then, I feel like I'm teaching you how to bake muffins or something, you're going to add the seat of power where the ruler lives and 3 smaller towns. Finally, the games master gets to go away and fill this world with stuff. Do you have to be creative? If you want. Or you can snuffle up ideas from the bottom of the book's pages, which are populated with them. Perhaps you place a secret vineyard on the other side of some fire nettles. Or perhaps one of your players annoyed you recently by not complimenting the nice moussaka you made them. And so outside of their home, you put a glue bog. Also, this is fun, landmarks are only found at the bottom of the myth pages. At the bottom of the night pages is stuff the GM just always needs. Like people, names, traits, states, animals, and objects. So if the GM ever needs one of those things, this whole book acts like a demented random table. And then bam, you got a name like Bruce, or people like Violent Playwright, and objects like a Shame Gem, or animals like Wolfie Hedgehog. And let's see what mood the hedgehog is in when you find it. It's thinking. So, once you've got your realm, which you could literally design in 5 minutes, or you could design in 5 evenings if you're on some Friends in the Table, that would be a very different show. Friends at the Table ass kick, where you want world building that's fat and overripe. What you need next is your player characters, you're gonna need your knights. But with 72 knights in this book, how are you gonna choose? Well, that's the neat part. You don't. With the cosmic unfairness of being born in real life, you grab a d6 and a d12 and bam! Just like that, you're the Gallows Knight. You can speak to animals, but only if they're gross and you feed them. Also, your unique method to restore your spirit is complaining to somebody you've just met. And yet, even if you wanted the War Knight and got the Dove Knight, if you wanted the Dove Knight and got the Pigeon Knight, if you wanted the Pigeon Knight and got the Ghoul Knight, there is something so fun about being given one of these freaks and just being told, yup, that's your player character. Before you've even started in session 1, this story has slipped the leash and is running off in an unexpected direction. Also, this situates you as a player in your character because thematically, each knight is knighted by a seer. Sinister people who are ostensibly on your side and know literally everything, and for whom Chris McDowall and Alec Sorenson reserved their most disgusting handiwork. And the game implies you don't choose what knight they're going to make you. Congratulations, you're the Rune Knight. Here's a stone pillar you have to drag around for the rest of your life, and a glass vial that if you shake it, scares birds. You got this, kid. Who's next? Players then roll their stats, which is simply vigor, clarity, spirit, and then you got guard, which is like your ability to fend off attacks without getting hurt. And holy crap, you thought the roll to see what knight you were was cruel? With these stats, there won't just be knights around the table that are better fighters than one another. There'll be better people as well. And look, if we were playing Dungeons and Dragons here, no one sat around the table would want their player character to be so much worse than everyone else's. But in Mythic Bastionland, where the game is watching all of these random elements arrive, like so much haunted conveyor belt sushi, and then letting the story that comes out of that stun all of you, having a player character who's worse is only bad if the game is about being useful. And the game here is not about being useful. It's about myths. One player in my home campaign did happen to roll incredibly well for his spirit and his guard. And the fact that he just outclassed everyone else powered the whole plot. It led to jealousy and tension and real bravery from the rest of the knights who knew he was the king in waiting and he'd probably be okay in any fight. But they knew they might die. Which sort of meant that they were the real protagonists of the story because they were the underdogs. They had so much more to lose. Especially because Mythic Bastionland is not a game designed for you to succeed. What problems await your knights? Will they defeat them? Will they even try to? You don't know until you start playing. Because this game is devoted wholeheartedly to the best thing in tabletop role-playing, which is that moment where you're waiting for a player to make the call, or you're waiting for the dice to stop moving, where the whole plot hangs in the balance and nobody knows what's going to happen next. Like the moment between a basketball being thrown and it landing in the basket or just ricocheting off the rim. I'll explain. Let's talk about the final bit of setup that the GM does before you begin. The last thing that happens before you start your plot is maybe the single most exciting bit of GM prep I can ever remember doing. That's not hyperboton. The GM takes that D6 and that D12 and rolls them 6 times to see which 6 myths are about to threaten your realm. So in my home game, the first thing I rolled was a pack of wolves that were not acting like wolves anymore, and a goblin who was interested in buying and selling prized possessions, such as horses, but also secrets. But in your game, you might roll not a creature, but a thing, like an accursed crown, or the sun breaking bad. Or you might roll a situation, like a great knight coming home, or you might roll a great knight coming home dead. Or you might get one of my favorites, a hole opening in the ground and people coming out that are just listed as hole folk, little ones of the hole. And then you, the GM, do not tell the players what you rolled. You just pick the 6 hexes where these myths kind of live, as if you're playing medieval Minesweeper. A hole's opened here, the crown can be found here, the sun shines here, or it used to, I guess. And just like that, believe it or not, you're ready to start playing, which might feel unusual. Your players are going to be frowning at their knights. The GM is going to be frowning at the myths they rolled, and all of you are going to be frowning at this map that didn't exist this time last week. A map that at once feels straightforward, but also packed tight with mystery, like you're looking at the paper map of a video game that none of you have played. And you're probably not going to feel ready. My friends and I certainly didn't feel ready. We took our first steps into this world like we were walking onto a lake, only to discover that it was in fact frozen solid. It did in fact hold our weight and we could proceed. And this, when you start playing, is the point that Mythic Bastionland goes from beautiful into true game design sorcery. But first, if you're enjoying this video, would you like some more? I'll go further. Would you like double the Quinns Quest content, but where I have even less of a filter? The Quinns Quest fan club was, of course, previously available as a magazine in which we really hoped that readers would be able to collect their own 18-piece dice bag, but the magazine was, of course, very sadly discontinued after issue 2. My apologies to the entire editorial team. Sam, Mandy, Max, Sandy, Ma'am, and dearest Nandad, I so appreciated you relocating to Stoke, but I'm sure you'll relish the opportunity to relocate back out again. But the Quinns Quest fan club lives on. Where on? Online. At www.patreon.com/QuickQuest, you'll find blogs, pods, vlogs, and Discord. There's a Discord channel where people spend literally all day talking about TTRPGs and saying things like, "Oh, I'd really like to play this game. Would someone like to play this game with me?" And someone else says, "I'll play that game with you." And then they play the game and it's all very wholesome. Dropping on the fan club today is my full hour-long interview with Mythic Bastionland designer Chris McDowall, in which you can hear him actually complain about his own demented decision to write 72 Knights, 72 Myths, and 72 Seers. You can also hear me gently suggest a way in which his game could have been better, and you can hear him diplomatically tell me, "No, Quinns, that would have been worse. But also on the fan club, like right now, today, now, if you like me talking about RPG systems, I've got a video talking about the systems that made me. As soon as I sat down with these books, a blast of ancient teenage dust just came out, and they stink, frankly. So that video that's live now isn't so much a trip down memory lane as a marathon in which I talk about what captured my young imagination to play these games, what I remember fondly about these systems, and where the stories I told went. You'll hear me talking about the epic D&D module that I ran 3 times for 3 separate groups and made me a fan of role-playing games for life. You'll hear me talking about my disastrous campaign of Traveller, which is now back in vogue. Back then I had no idea what I was doing. I'll even talk about the campaign I played with my exclusively white friends in problematic Asian-inspired RPG Legend of the Five Rings, in which we told a story that mostly centered around our honor. You better believe that shit's going behind the paywall. It's all happening at patreon.com/quest. If you're a fan of my work, you should pledge just $3.99 and get access to a dragon's hoard of it. Back to the review. So let's finally talk about how Mythic Bastionland plays, what happens in this world that you've made. And let's do this in 2 parts. First, let's talk about this from the player's perspective, which is tense but empowering, and then I'm going to talk about this from the GM's perspective, where it's empowering but also tense. So your campaign will start with the GM giving the players their first omen from a randomly rolled myth. So each of your myths is presented as 6 omens, which are basically a countdown of 6 increasingly stressful scenes. So at your home table, your campaign of Mythic might begin at the King's Round Table, with the players hearing tell that to the east, a funeral procession is bringing the Moth Knight home to be buried in her home soil. She was a great knight, but a poor ruler. And so your king says to the players, go and see if they need any help with the funeral. So far, to the players, this could be a normal role-playing game. But it's not. The key thing for the players as they set off into the world map on their totally unique, terrible horses that might be bright-eyed or bearded or apparently boneless, because who doesn't want to ride into battle with something with the structure of a chicken tender? They don't know exactly where they're going beyond, like, east, maybe? Because only the GM knows where the myths are originating. And that is good. I'm going to explain. Like, how many D&D adventures start with, there's trouble at the mine, go to the mine. And so where do you go? You go to the mine. That's not a decision, and therefore it's not really a game, because games are a sequence of interesting decisions, right? So, since the dawn of role-playing games, designers and GMs have been experimenting with a hex map, creating a game that's called a hex crawl, where players don't know where they're going, they're visiting each little hex. Now, what I'm about to say next is a conclusion that I was able to get to only after watching this excellent video by Mystic Arts, but there are 2 problems with hex crawls. If your players don't have any information on where they're going, then the hex crawl is functionally pointless. You're really not making decisions, you're just traveling at random. And in the words of the Cheshire Cat from Alice in Wonderland, if you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there. Conversely though, if players have too much information about the world map, then they're always just able to plot the shortest or best route between where they are and where they want to get to. Again, they're not making decisions, it's just someone dressed their atlas up in fishnets. Players are on the hunt for these myths, right? But because the myths are quite abstract, players are paying attention to every little clue, every little vibe shift, every little NPC. They're going to be asking, what do you know about this goblin? Also, because the realm is small and because you're going to be retracing your steps across it for the entire campaign, what is in every hex or how those hexes change because of your actions all becomes valuable knowledge. Ugh, who put a glue bog here? We are never coming back here again. Also, because the myths are epic and because the players exist in a multi-generational sense, everything has the potential to change the world, which makes it feel precious but also threatened. And most importantly, if, like me, you're a GM who doesn't set out to be cruel but doesn't necessarily hate it when my players suffer, a lot of hex crawls are based on a resource management system, right? Where players need supplies, they need to balance supplies. And again, this often fails to be a game because if the players have enough supplies, they don't need to think about it. If the players have no supplies, there's nothing they can do. Mythic Bastionland has a resource management game that is so much better than managing supplies, and it's so mean and I love it so much. You know when you've got a school bully and then there's that like pathetic kid behind the bully going, haha, yeah, That's me. That's me stood behind Mythic Bastionland. This game is mean, and I'm stood behind it going, haha, yeah. So outside of combat, Mythic Bastionland uses a super simple dice resolution mechanic where you just try and roll under your stat on a d20. There's no skills in this game because, of course, it's medieval times, and skills haven't been invented yet. But here's the thing. In Mythic Bastionland, all of your stats are your health bars. Your vigor that determines if you can run or climb or swim, that is your health. If you get shot by an arrow for 6 points and your vigor goes from 13 to 7, you're now trying to roll under 7 on a d20. But this is the case with all of your stats. If you get a horrendous night's sleep, your clarity gets lower. If you make a depressing discovery, your spirit might slip away. Or if your GM is a dick, naming no names, you might have two players roleplay a really intense argument between their two characters, and then the GM goes, "That was great, you guys. Please both lose one spirit." And while every knight has a totally awesome, flavorful, unique way to recover their spirit, you only recover your vigor from a night spent in warm hospitality. Look forward to your players arguing that a blind man offering them melted snow in a tin cup counts as warm hospitality. And clarity only comes back after your players have a conversation with a seer, none of whom do anything so convenient as living in any of the towns you're visiting because, I'll say again, they're just awful people. I love that this game has the equivalent of a Merlin or a Gandalf figure that you can visit, but the main reason not to do so is that they're just the worst. Perhaps your realm will be home to the celebrated seer, who can see the future but only the moments of intense positivity in it, and lives for praise and elaborate celebrations, not really caring what for. Or maybe you roll the torn seer, a man cleaved in half from head to groin, and the two halves hold themselves together but act like two people and always present two possibilities, two opinions, two predictions. Again, there are 72 of these pricks and they are all awesome. Anyway, so this stat loss is the accursed game of resource management you're playing as your party is hiking around. You're looking for these myths which are getting more and more dangerous, but as you travel, you're getting more tired and muddled and miserable. Sure, this ogre you've heard a lot about sounds like a real piece of shit, but you could probably defeat them on a good day. The question Mythic Bastionland asks is, could you defeat them on a bad day? And you know what that question is? That's good, clean fun. There's one more thing to teach you about traveling around the hex map, and I've actually saved the best, my favorite mechanic, for last. So as your players cross the hex map, there's always about a 50% chance they're going to find another omen. And there's a chance this could be from any myth, but it's twice as likely to belong to the nearest myth. So if players are near this ominous pack of wolves, they might enjoy the next, still more ominous scene from that story, but they could encounter anything. But the GM never tells you whether what you're encountering in this hex is what's always in there, or if it's from a myth, and if it is from a myth, what myth it's from. And so now with all of these mechanics guiding us like a constellation of stars, you can see how this humble hex map starts to play as intelligently as a game like Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom. The players are told to go north, but then they go that way and see something unexpected. So now your table of players is fretting about, is this the next omen relating to the myth they were following already? Or a different myth? Is it a myth at all? Maybe that crow was just a weird little guy. And before you know it, you've got multiple spooky plot threads competing for your attention. They're all getting worse, but also your stats are starting to look a bit wonky. One of you's weak at the knees, one of you's bleary-eyed, one of you's just depressed. But here's the thing, if you decide to return back to a town or go to talk to a seer, the myths continue to get worse on your way back. And finally, the totality of the cruel game you're playing is revealed. Hidden around this world are the fuses of 6 bombs that are hissing away with every other step you take. All too often, failure in role-playing games is something the GM threatens the players with, but it never really comes to pass. Mythic Bastionland is absolutely making threats that it will make good on, and I love it for that. As your players are riding their horse across this landscape, it trembles with tension because at the end of every myth is exactly what happens if you fail. Your regent may die, towns may burn, or Jesus, how do you feel about the very sky turning into a rippling, endless ceiling of skulls that bellow new laws that the cowering humans below must follow each season? Page 103. Which isn't to say Mythic Bastionland is truly a mean game, it's just high stakes. If D&D is a safe job where you can expect regular promotions, Mythic Bastionland is robbing banks. If you find a magic sword in this game, you will be the strongest human being in the world. Or like, if you participate in beating just 2 myths and winning 1 duel, your character will have enough glory to become the leader of one of the shittier towns on the map. Also, if you fail a myth, your queen may have to permanently share the realm with another regent known as the Toad, the Fat Lord, born to rule. And maybe that town that you just became the ruler of is technically in the Fat Lord's territory, and now you owe that frog taxes. And maybe then that means the story becomes your character rebelling against him. And maybe that's how you die. And that is fine, because that means you get another pull on King Arthur's Gachapon. All that said though, I would be doing this game a disservice if it... I've never twirled a book's ribbon around before, like it's white girl wasted. I'd be doing a disservice if I implied that this book was grimdark, like a Morkborg or a Warhammer 40,000, because actually, it is more nuanced and more interesting than that. It has a glimmer of hope, and that makes this world worth fighting for.
I wanted to have it feel like there was some hope to it. It's not like the Golden Age has passed. It's like, well, we're just before the Golden Age, potentially. So yeah, things like there not being any roads in the setting. Like roads are mentioned in passing in something to do with when you're like building a great project, you could potentially build a road like between 2 holdings, which would be like some incredible thing that's never really happened before. There's definitely a bit of kind of misery and mud about the implication, but I've tried to keep it on a kind of not too bleak of an angle.
So, if you're the kind of GM who is fetishistic about prep, which I sometimes, not frequently, find myself to be, you will have a lovely time with Mythic Bastionland, planning all the details of the 6 myths and their NPCs, fleshing out each of the towns in the world, all the seers, all the key players' motivations. But if you're the kind of GM who doesn't enjoy prep, or doesn't have time for prep, or perhaps only GMs because they have to, and really wants to show up on a Tuesday night like a player with no idea what's going to happen, Mythic Bastionland doesn't just still work, it's maybe a superior experience. Let me just do a brief tangent here to talk about one of the stickiest secrets about GMing that many of us haven't fully admitted to ourselves yet. Content that a games master has lovingly prepared ahead of time is often very entertaining. And content that a GM is often just panically making up right there at the table in response to what the players say is often just as entertaining. Sure, content that you are just bullshitting right there in the moment is often less polished, it's maybe less cinematic, but there is also an intrinsic joy for a player in watching the GM sweat a little bit and watching a story that bends more according to their choices, their agency, their motivations, and that is what the hobby of role-playing is all about, that freedom. And the thing with Mythic Bastionland is it is designed entirely around that freedom. You don't know what omen is going to proc next. You don't know which myth your players are going to prioritize. You don't know if they're going to raise an army of peasants and then proceed to treat that army so badly that the peasants become the biggest threat to the realm. You don't know if your players are going to go and bother a seer who, let me remind you, knows everything but always asks for a price for what the players ask them. How do you prepare for that? There is no greater feeling in this hobby as a player than announcing your action and watching the GM's mouth fall open. You know, it's funny, intrinsic to the words game master is this idea of domination. This is my game and you're playing it. And that's kind of a misnomer because there is so much fantastically fun, submissive behavior in this hobby. Not being a games master, but a game servant where the player declares what they're going to do in this story and you, the GM, go, wait, but that would mean hang on, but if you do that, then he would shit. Oh, okay, here's what happens. Also, just on the subject of prep in this game not being very useful, don't forget that at the end of each session, the players decide how much time passes, whether that's a night or a week or a season or an age. How do you prep for that? Imagine you've decided what every single NPC's name is and what they're up to, and then your players go, yeah, I think 20 years pass now. What are you going to do as a GM? I'll tell you what you're going to do. You're going to make the damage sound from Dark Souls. You're going to be like, oh, It's also worth remembering that as a GM, the more you prep, you're not just calcifying the story that's about to happen, you're also calcifying the world. Like, in my home game of Mythic Bastionland, there was a point when my players were fighting the ogre, and I narrated that he had this crown made of twigs like a bird's nest. And one of my players said, oh, he's wearing a crown and he's bald. He's proud. And that was a great observation. And if I had in my notes that the ogre wasn't proud, then that observation is just lost. But instead, I'm able to be like, shit, that's interesting. He's proud. Okay. That player is rewarded for playing the game well, but also the entire evening becomes smoother and faster because the GM isn't just telling each of the players how the world is for the entire evening. The players are also telling the GM how the world is, and the more you prep, the less you can do that. So yeah, as written, the GM in Mythic Bastionland is often just making shit up all the time. And I have a very special message to all the GMs watching this who think, this game looks great, but I couldn't do that. Yes, you can. Listen to me. Listen to me. Get close. Closer. Closer. Get close. Get really close. This game doesn't just make it easy to make shit up. It makes you and me look good. One thing that Mythic Bastionland takes off your plate immediately is pacing, which is a very hard thing for GMs to finesse, because this game has an idiosyncratic, relentless pace you don't control, because as players take each step, there's a 50% chance an omen's gonna flap darkly across the sky, or scream from over the hill, or walk up to the player's tents and ask for porridge. Another reason that this game makes making stuff up kind of effortless is because it's mythic. It's in the game. That is the theme we return to over and over again. And I don't know if you've ever read myths, but like the Epic of Gilgamesh reads like a GM is making it up on the fly. And that's, I think, because what mythic really means when you're telling a story is that anything can be anything. You know, a crow can be a crow, or a crow can be intelligent. The sun can do its job, or it can just not. And so what that means, I think, in Mythic Bastionland is that bad ideas have this wiggle room, that they don't seem bad, they just seem strange. And when things seem strange, they seem on theme. Third, yes, this game does expect you to cook, but also it gives you all of the ingredients. You've got spark tables, you've got random prompts at the bottom of pages, and you've got these myths which aren't just NPCs and cool scenes, they're whole ass little arcs for you. And the fourth and final reason why I think Mythic Bastionland makes it so easy for even novice GMs, perhaps that's you watching this, to GM a fun game is that it has something that hooks players into the plot deeply without you doing anything. And that is, it gives players power. Power to impact the story, yes, but also the power to decide where they want to go, which is always going to be equally entertaining because it's always proccing omens. And here's the crazy part. The players can raise warbands, rule towns, sit on councils, plan developments from as quickly as the first session. The players don't need you to make their lives interesting or exciting. The players just need you to add complexity, and anyone can do that.
Yeah, it all comes from sort of looking through D&D books and feeling like, you know, when you're looking at those high-level spells and you're thinking, oh, wouldn't it be cool if my players had like a wish spell? But then the reality of sort of, at least my experience was, well, I'm mostly playing like one-shots and maybe short campaigns. I never did like the idea that, yeah, you have to earn the fun stuff, or at least earn the interesting stuff. I'm very keen to put those things right in the like session one.
There is, however, one slightly intense thing that the GM will have to improvise, which is how the players actually defeat the myths. Seems pretty important, right? But nowhere on this sheet is written down how this story actually ends. So your players are probably just going to try something. I bury the cursed crown. I shackle the goblin and take him back to the capital. I climb to where the sun is absent from the sky and ask in very strong words for it to return. And you need to make the call if that works, or if it doesn't, or if it's a dice roll. I'm flagging this not because it's particularly hard from the GM, but just because it's a little bit shocking. You get these adventures, they say exactly what happens if the players fail, and that's it. But at my table, honestly, ending these myths simply felt very natural. If my player had a great idea that was super on theme or just a beautiful play, I said it worked. If my players had an idea that was quite good, I let that be a dice roll. Or if you've got a player whose solution is just plain lazy, don't hesitate, and punish the little squirt. So Dunstan, that was rubbish. Not only does it fail, everyone who's watching is disappointed in you. So who's watching? Your horse? Your horse loses 5 spirit. Here's a case study for you. In my campaign, the players took on the ogre. And the one fact the GM has about the ogre is that if you don't have its name, it cannot be harmed. So you know what one of my players did? He rode out, can I speak and do this at the same time? Being a drummer is hard. He rode out on his horse and spoke to the ogre and said, I wish to swear an oath and become your knight, because the ogre's proud, right? I wish to become your knight, but I can't swear an oath to you until I know your name. Brilliant, genius, straight out of Myth. Of course I said the ogre, told the players his name, and then my players hacked him to pieces. One of my players actually narrated that they were going to hack its dick off first. And speaking of dicks and the hacking thereof, let's move on to my one piece of criticism about this game. I have but one criticism of Mythic Bastionland, and Chris McDowall, if you're watching this, listen up, because this is only coming once. I think the combat in your game is great, but I think it could have been better. If I know Chris McDowall, I think he's proud of his designs, and he's probably watching this right now thinking, go f yourself, Quinns. And you know what? That's fair. Because I'm actually of the opinion that no role-playing game I've ever played has a particularly great combat system. Here's the thing, my criticism of Mythic Bastionland's combat can be compared to that of a teacher who is the absolute harshest to the smartest kid in the class, because they're the one that might do something with their lives. They might get us out of this town! So, if you've only played Dungeons & Dragons, Mythic Bastionland's combat comes at you with the kineticism of someone throwing a baseball at your sternum. Let's put my baseball back. It's rolling and it's not going to stay there. How did I do this before? There we go. Combat in Mythic Bastionland is turn-based, and whenever anyone attacks, they roll a dice pool according to their gear. You got a big sword? That's a D8. You got a shield in your offhand? That's a D4. Are you charging into combat on a warhorse as opposed to the 72 grody ponies you start the game with? That's D8 trample damage. The GM can also give you extra narrative dice in case you're fighting smart or dirty. Maybe your opponent is drunk or afraid. You then take this fistful of violence and you roll the whole thing, and there's no rolling to hit here, you just get prizes. Any die higher than a 3 can be binned to buy gambits that everyone in the world has access to, like moving your character, buying yourself some space, trapping a foe's weapon for the next turn, or any other clever narrative tricks you're panically thinking of. You can also bin a 3 or higher to get +1 to another die, because once you're done with gambits, the highest die remaining is how much damage you do. If I had to use one word, Mythic Bastionland's combat is clattering, with lots of fun, very tense rolling of dice back and forth, with knights trapping one another's weapon and then hitting back and hitting back. If you've seen Ridley Scott's inexplicably excellent movie The Last Duel, you'll have an idea of the kind of heft and danger that I'm talking about here. It is a wrestling match with razor blades. Now, what's cute is that your saving throw against a gambit, like someone using their gauntleted hand to grab your sword and pin it against the wall, is your vigor. You try and roll under your vigor on d20, but don't forget your vigor is also your hit points. And so there's this very frightening sensation to combat in Mythic where everyone's willing their fattest die to give up the goods. Yes, that's a 10! Because if you can start chipping away at your opponent's vigor, then you can start catching them out with tricks that get around their saving throw. It's a game where if you start losing, you keep losing. And I love this because I personally adore combat systems in RPGs that capture how tiring fights are. That's what makes me feel like I'm fighting for my life and not like I'm sat here doing my maths homework. So imagine my delight then when Mythic Bastionland layers 2 further systems on top of this combat, both about exhaustion, both super thematic. So first, on top of everyone's 3 main stats, everyone has a 4th statistic called Guard. And you can think of this a bit like the shield in Halo or Destiny, if you've played those video games, where when you're out of combat, it recovers quite quickly, because your Guard stat is hit points, but it recovers whenever the danger has passed. That's the rule. Which means this is a game where circling your horses away to flee the combat and just catch your breath, or using a piece of furniture to block a stairwell just to buy yourself 60 seconds to breathe, those are super valuable but very tense strategies, and it makes the game feel like you're going like around in a boxing match, then you're finding time to just breathe again and figure out if you can go back into that fight. The next system, and this led to some of just the juiciest decisions in my campaign, let's talk about feats. Knights can do feats. I love feats. You know what, actually, let me just pause this explanation to say something else. If you're watching this and thinking, oh, this all seems quite complicated, yes, you're right. Mythic Bastionland's combat is not simple, but here's the thing. Unlike D&D, which puts you in a combat kindergarten and then gets more complicated as it goes on, Mythic Bastionland says, hey, let's not waste time here. Your first fight should be just as exciting as your fifth. And so the combat system is really good at the start of the game, but here's the thing, never gets more complicated after that. It's just a wicked little game that you can master as you play more of it. Okay. Back to feats. So why were me and my players losing my mind with the system? Okay, let me explain. In a combat round, a knight, and this includes enemy knights, which is a great curveball if your players aren't expecting it, can do a feat. You can smite, hitting with the force of a truck. You can focus, getting a free gambit like disarming your enemy that they cannot defend against. Or you can deny. You can take the highest die in your opponent's pool and just say no, get rid of it. Now, in Mythic Bastionland's world of lethal integers, these are all superpowers. But there's a catch. After you smite, you have to make a vigor save. After you focus, you have to make a clarity save. And after you deny, you have to make a spirit save. And if you fail, you cannot do a feat again until your character has a little sleep. Now, let me nerd it up for a second and channel the board game journalist that I once was and still am, for anyone wondering. This simple mechanic is so good because for as long as you have a feat ready to go, you're bloody Captain America. The lance crashes into your shield at 40 miles an hour for, I deny it. Today, you and I will see who is the greater warrior. I kick him off the tower. Sir Dunstan, the 20 lumberjacks are bearing down on you. I use smite and swing my great sword to cut down 4 of them. That would be a morale check, don't you think? Damn it, Sir Dunstan, you've done it again. But the reason this mechanic will always have your players staring down at their character sheet and sweating like they're about to bet their car keys in a poker game is because if they do a feat and then fail the following saving throw, they've just lost their nuclear deterrent and now they're just a tired guy, temporarily balanced on a difficult horse. And then just narratively, once you add in the fact that your characters in your story all have different stats and the plot lines and the myths are so unpredictable, this feat system just regularly coughs up such glorious scenes. Like if you've got a character with really high spirit, them continually denying attacks that would kill them is some Errol Flynn shit. Or like a character who's been battered around so much their vigor is now super low, declaring, okay, I'll smite, feels like them signing their own death sentence. Or like your characters all deciding to ride back into battle on their horses, even though they're all fatigued and none of them can do feats anymore. That's real heroism. So now, I'm sure there's more than a few of you watching this who've been paying attention who are like, hang on, Quinns, didn't you introduce this section on combat so you could complain? Wasn't this supposed to be a criticism section? Yes, you guys can give yourselves an experience point. So here's my problem. I am delighted in how Mythic Bastionland achieves everything I've explained to you with just a stupid 16 pages of rules. But I think, if I may be so bold, that it should have been 17 pages. I think this book really needs a page on designing and balancing combat encounters. Because these myths in the book, with just the power of your imagination, it's like adding water to instant mashed potato and suddenly you've got this full satisfying meal. That is not true of the combat and the enemies and the stat blocks printed on these minimalist adventures. All you get in each myth is just 3 stat blocks with absolutely no scaling for how many players you even have at your table. And with this combat system, it's like Chris McDowall, that's quite good, isn't it? Chris McDowall has given you the keys to a Formula 1 car. That's what this combat system feels like. And then you're like, Chris, this is awesome. Where am I going to drive it? And then he gestures vaguely at the lawn behind his house. So it was probably about the 3rd session of Mythic Bastionland when I realized in my home game that even the epic enemies, as presented in the book, were too easy for my party when they all worked together. So I was like, okay, let's fix that. Then, by the 6th session of Mythic, one of my players pointed out, you know, we've played a lot of this combat and I've realized I only really love it when we've got some other objective besides just killing the enemy or some weird terrain for us to worry about. And I said, okay, let's give like sub-objectives and complications to these combat encounters. And then by session 9 of our campaign, I had another realization. I realized that if my players were all fighting the same big monster, when they rolled their dice pool together, the player who'd most grokked the combat was telling other people how to do gambits. So I was like, okay, let's divide this party up so they're fighting foes separately and so players aren't backseat gaming for one another. And then it was the end of our campaign. Now, it's not like any of the fights we had were bad. And in fact, some of them were absolutely fantastic. You might not even notice the fine detailing and the balancing that I'm describing, but me, I'm a fussy son of a bitch. And when everything else in Mythic was so smooth it ran like pure magic, I was finishing sessions of Mythic and saying goodbye to my friends and making myself a tea and thinking about the combat like, Or I was tucking myself in bed and I was still thinking about the combat like, But overall, the combat in Mythic Bastionland is still a triumph, and I do want to reward this game. So I'm going to finish this review by talking about just one combat encounter where all of the stars aligned. It was just absolutely fantastic. So there's this suggestion in the Mythic Bastionland book that if you like, every knight gets a squire. And my players latched onto this idea. In fact, they all had two characters. They were their own knight and another knight's squire. And this has all kinds of cool side effects. Like, you can learn a lot about a knight player character by how they treat their squire. That's an interesting relationship. And also, maybe more importantly, you can split the party and everyone can be involved in those scenes because, yes, your knight isn't there, but you're still playing that player's squire who is there. So this fight, let me get my whiteboard. Okay, so my players were exploring this little dungeon that was the lair of the ogre, right? And they encountered in that dungeon a slave of the ogre, the Insect Knight, who was a morally dubious NPC, but they said, okay, just come with us and we'll deal with you later. Then the three knight characters, my players, all went through this doorway, which was a trap, and the door slammed shut, trapping them in the next room. This was an unexpected development for me as the GM, but then I realized the Insect Knight, at this point, being locked in the room with the three squires of the knights, would now say, okay, your knights are dead, follow me back out, and I'll be your leader. And the three players, who in this scene now swapped to playing their squires, did something they'd never done before. They stood up for themselves. And they said, no, yeah, Insect Knight, even though you outrank us, we're not abandoning our masters. And I said, okay, the Insect Knight draws steel. This is a fight. And we had this wonderful moment where for the first time they all swapped character sheets and looked at their squire's stats and realized, oh man, one of us is absolutely going to die here, if not two, if not three. And these were characters we loved. The melee that followed taught us how beautiful Mythic's combat can be when all the stars align. With the saddest dice pools you've ever seen, with a working knowledge of how absolutely busted the rules for knights are, and with the Insect Knight's ability to, I quickly checked my book, control insects? We engaged in a brawl with my players sacrificing whole turns to just grab the knight's sword with their bare hands, or grab at his feet, with nobody at the table daring to draw breath as I rolled each of the Insect Knight's attacks, knowing that if I rolled a number high enough, that was it. They were dead. It was peak. None of my players ended up dying. They all survived, but for the grace of God, and the Insect Knight was slain. Now, my point here is this is not an example of how Mythic Bastionland's combat is better if the players are disempowered. It's an example of how good this game's combat can be when the combat is balanced. The campaign also had two duels where one knight simply fought another knight, and those fights were absolutely tremendous as well. So, allow me to sheathe my sword, because that's my review of Mythic Bastionland, everybody. A game I cannot recommend highly enough. A design like a beautiful medieval stained glass window that provides you these fabulous silhouettes. And then you and your friends, you're like the sun shining through this window, giving it color, giving it texture, making it holy, making it yours. And as you'll hear if you listen to the interview with Chris McDowall that I have on my Patreon, one of the next designs he's working on is a sequel to this book called Intergalactic Bastionland, inspired by classic RPG Traveller. I literally could not be more excited. Here's Chris McDowall paying it forward with a couple of other games that he recommends.
Yeah, so the first one I wanted to pick was Vaults of Varn by Leo Hunt, which is a science fantasy kind of weird Dying Earth style game. It packs so much flavour into its content that everything from the sort of the character classes that you might have, I hesitate to call them classes, they're more like archetypes, and all of the random tables and all of the locations and factions that are written in very terse terms just are so inspirational, and it's a real masterclass in how to pack a bunch of setting and flavour into some very, very small packages, and I believe it's getting a fancy hardback release sometime soon. The other one I wanted to talk about is not really a release, so I wanted to include The Glog, or The Goblin Laws of Gaming, which is originally by Arnold Kemp, who writes at Goblin Punch, but is now spread like a virus across the sort of OSR blogosphere. It is a very stripped-back D&D hack, but some of the class design in particular is absolutely bonkers and wild. The most beautiful thing about it is it's not just a book, you have to explore all of these different blogs. So if you are at all interested in what's happening in RPG design, dive into the Glog well and see what you can find.
Thank you so much for watching, everybody. And if you'd like to know more about some of the terminology in this video, such as what is a knight or what is a horse, simply return to the main menu of your Quinns Quest database.